Let's talk about ginger. Ginger is such a cool spice because it's medicinal in almost any preparation. In fact, if it's there and present in the food, then it's pretty much impossible to destroy and make it not medicinal. So I love that, whether it's like ginger candies, or this morning I made gingerbread pancakes for the family. And that I used about a quarter cup of fresh grated ginger and a whole bunch of dried ginger and molasses and made these gingerbread pancakes. So you can use ginger in all different kinds of ways. You're probably familiar with ginger in both its fresh form and its dried form. And I think of these as two different spices almost entirely. The dried form is spicy and acrid and pungent and pretty intense. The fresh form is a lot more juicy and warming and aromatic than it is hot and acrid. So I use them actually quite differently. I wouldn't substitute one for the other in most situations. So it's nice to have a little bit of ginger on hand if it's something you can get. So how do we use ginger? Again, you can use it any way you want. You can put it in all sorts of different kinds of foods. You can even sprinkle a little bit on top. But you're going to find it's a strong spice, and it's actually spicier than you might realize. If you just put a lot of the powder, it can be pretty darn heating for a lot of people. So a little goes a long way. It's also super affordable, which is great. And it pairs really well with a little bit of sweet or tart, like lemon and honey and so on. But, endless recipes out there for ginger that you can find. And I really love ginger along with like cinnamon and cloves and things like that. I'm going to share one of my favorite recipes for using ginger in that way when we go into the kitchen a little later. So some cool research around ginger and also how we use ginger. Ginger is great as an overall warming tonic for the body. It's very heating. It helps with circulation. It also is really helpful in all different types of inflammation, especially inflammation where there's not a lot of heat. So osteoarthritis is a great example of inflammation where there tends to not be as much heat. There's a lot of stagnancy and so on. So I was just reading a paper about a knee osteoarthritis. There was 120 patients with knee osteoarthritis, and they took 500 milligrams a day, which is a super small amount of ginger. And when you're looking at dried ginger, 500 milligrams is like this much ginger. They took 500 milligrams a day of ginger, and they had significant decrease in a number of inflammatory factors as compared to the placebo. So pretty neat stuff with just taking a very simple, very affordable amount of ginger. I bet you could get that much ginger for $2 a month to be able to take a dose like that. And of course, osteoarthritis is very prevalent. So different types of inflammation can respond really well to something like ginger. I also really like to think about it as immune support, helpful in preventing colds and flus and so on. It's a great thing on a cold winter time when you're gathering with people to have a lot of ginger, like fresh ginger tea boiling on the stove, a little bit of lemons and honey on the side, that people can help support themselves and their respiratory and immune systems by drinking that tea. It's also great for digestion, especially if you tend to get cold, you have kind of cold digestion and you want to warm it up. So bitters are great, but ginger is kind of more of an aromatic in that way. So it can be wonderful if you experience a lot of nausea and stagnancy and so on. So ginger and nausea often go together really well. So that can be something that you can try. Some other cool things about ginger. The anti-inflammatory effects in ginger are pretty profound. And another cool paper looked at some weight training individuals. So they were doing their weight training. And a lot of times when you do weight training, that's intense exercise and you can actually cause a little bit of muscle damage. And that's kind of typical soreness. That's why you have soreness after you do this and your body heals from that and it goes on. But actually the people taking ginger had lower blood markers lower blood inflammatory markers and less post-exercise muscle pain as well. So really helpful for people who are doing a lot of exercise and a lot of movement or who tend to get sore from doing different kinds of things. Another really cool one was a double-blind, placebo-controlled randomized trial looking at middle-aged women and the cognitive effects of ginger. And so they actually just gave them pretty small amounts, about what I was showing you, or a little bit more than that, or a placebo. And they found that they had significant improvement over the placebo group in both attention and cognitive processing. So this is a really common thing you hear from people. They're like, oh, I feel spacey. I feel like I need to focus more. Something as simple as ginger is a wonderful recommendation because it's safe, it's affordable, it's accessible, and of course, it's also super delicious. Let's talk about cinnamon. I love cinnamon. If I had to choose a favorite spice, it would always be a top contender for a favorite spice. In fact, I love cinnamon so much, I named my daughter Cassia. So there's a little irony there because if you're familiar with cinnamon, one of the important things about cinnamon is to make sure that you are getting the right genus and species. There's a lot of plants out there that are called cinnamon. And what you're mostly looking for medicinal species is Cinnamomum verum, or previously called Cinnamomum zeylanicum. And that is a different cinnamon than the cassia cinnamon. So they all taste cinnamony. And a lot of what you're tasting when you have that really bold, spicy cinnamon is cassia cinnamon, which is fine for cooking, but less medicinal because of the coumarins. With the cassia cinnamons, then you don't really want to be taking them all the time because of the coumarin levels in the cinnamon. What you really want to be doing is to take the cassia cinnamon. So, no, sorry, to take the Cinnamomum cinnamon. So I'm going to confuse you. So here's, this is from Mountain Rose. This is a sweet cinnamon powder. And you can see Cinnamomum verum and sweet cinnamon powder. This is the medicinal species that I would tend to use if I'm going to be cooking. So this is going to be a little bit more expensive. If it doesn't say that it's Cinnamomum verum or true cinnamon or Sri Lankan cinnamon or something like that, then it's not. It's cassia cinnamon. So especially if it's like Latin American cinnamon or so on, it's not usually this species. And if you've seen cinnamon as cinnamon sticks before, which you probably have, these are generally going to be the cassia cinnamon because the true cinnamon is actually very flaky and falls apart really easily. And it's not as good for throwing into your hot apple cider or something like that. So you can use it that way, but when people think about cinnamon sticks that you can like bang around and so on, these are going to be the cassia cinnamon type. So cinnamon, I mean, there's endless ways to use cinnamon. There's so much wonderful medicinal information, so many applications. I like to think of cinnamon as one of my favorite carminatives. So really supportive for digestive distress and digestive upset, even on an ongoing basis. I'm going to share with you one of my favorite recipes for that in a little bit. And it's just fantastic. How medicinal cinnamon can be in that way. So I also think of cinnamon a lot in supporting people who have a uterus. The people who have a uterus often can have like boggy, cold cycles, or things can, feel just like very heavy before they actually start bleeding. And so by using cinnamon, it can be warming and very moving. And that can be a wonderful way to move things along. So I love cinnamon in that way as a little bit of a gentle emmenagogue. So that's helpful if you have a uterus and you experience things like that. One of the best ways that it's used contemporarily is to support a healthy blood sugar balance. And so you can do some great things supporting a healthy blood sugar balance with cinnamon. There's so much research on it. And it's also incredibly safe, it's affordable, and it's delicious. I mean, I find that of all the spices, cinnamon is one of the ones that people dislike the least. So people love cinnamon, that kind of deliciousness. And one of the cool things about cinnamon you might not know is it's actually a little bit of a mucilage. If you put cinnamon in water and you cook it, it actually turns gooey. So it does have a mucilaginous property. Before I knew this, I'd put a ton of cinnamon in something like hot apple cider and I'd cook it. And then at the end, I'd be like, what is this gooey stuff in the bottom of my pot? Like, where did it come from? And that was the cinnamon and its mucilage over time. So there's some really cool research on cinnamon. There's a lot of things around working memory and diabetes, which is really, really interesting. So if you have impaired memory function, especially if you find that you get a little bit of brain foggy after eating, or if you're pre-diabetic, cinnamon has been shown in certain studies to be very helpful in working memory that's impaired in pre-diabetics. There's also a great blood sugar stabilization effect of Cinnamon, there's a lot of research around looking at cinnamon and people who have labile blood sugar or their hemoglobin A1C levels are not optimal, which that kind of is like a broader snapshot of how steady your blood sugar levels are. So people who have taken cinnamon, even just a gram a day, which again is a pretty small amount, super easy to take a gram, just sprinkle that on any of your food, then you can definitely be using cinnamon in that way. And people have found that to be incredibly helpful for stabilizing or improving hemoglobin A1C levels. There's also some interesting cinnamon research for people who aren't pre-diabetic, who just find that after eating, they feel tired or they feel sluggish. Cinnamon can be a great accompaniment in your meals when you do that. So how to use cinnamon? Most of you probably already know how to use cinnamon. It's great in all sorts of sweet dishes and in all sorts of savory dishes. It's easy to sprinkle it on top. If anything ever calls for like a quarter teaspoon of cinnamon, just disregard that entirely. I don't even know if I've ever measured cinnamon. I usually like the container I have it in has, the shaker on one side and the big opening on the other. And I just dump it in usually with the big opening because there's just so much to love about cinnamon. And I find, there's a lot of delicious things that you can have. So over those gingerbread pancakes I mentioned, we sauteed a lot of really cinnamony apples, super cinnamony apples, and put those on top of those pancakes. And they were absolutely delicious. So lots of ways to use cinnamon. You can definitely add it to cooked foods. You can add it when you're cooking your foods. And I'm going to show you one of my very favorite cinnamon recipes so you can add more of it into your life.